It's Monday, April 7th. I'm Jacob Shymanski with co-host Grant Hardy. You're listening to AMI Today. Is truly unbiased political reporting even possible? And while that's an interesting thought experiment for us, it's a real question for the CBC and the CTV and the Globe and Mail. They really have to tackle it. And as consumers of news reporting, we can't control how the news is reported, but we can control the mindset we take when reading the news. My view, Grant, is that we should never assume an article is unbiased because articles are always going to be biased in some shape or form depending on like what they choose to leave in and out. Even things down to word choice. Like if you were to say Padiev spoke to a large enthusiastic crowd yesterday, you could also word that as just simply Padiev was in Kingston yesterday giving a speech to supporters. Two very different images, right? There's an endless amount of decisions the author makes when writing an article, consciously or otherwise, that lead to inevitable biases. But if this inevitable bias freaks you out, like what's the alternative? Just bury your head in the sand? No. Our only option, in my opinion, is to sift through these articles with a critical lens, which is not controversial. But my point is that you can't just bury your head in the sand and neglect to keep yourself informed at all. Are you on board with me on this?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think we don't see the extreme polarization of media that we do in the States, maybe. But biases are not always clear. Humans are fallible. And yeah, 100% don't bury your head in the sand. I also think it definitely having exposure to different media that maybe isn't your favorite
Yes.
format or source is really important.
That's why it's not that crazy to have newspapers that are left or right leaning, as long as they're not blatantly and egregiously so. At least you're getting the biases from both sides and kind of get a picture. And then you can use your critical thinking to decide, I actually lean more this way. And the best thing you can do, in my opinion, is read these articles as they come out, but also go and watch a Polyev speech. Go and watch Carney speak. Go and
Yeah.
watch Singh's speech.
Watch,
And
listen.
for like 20, 30 minutes, like really get a vibe of these people. Grant, we're it's audiobook review in the second half of today's show, but I think I'm just eager to get to talking about election coverage because this is really interesting to me. We're talking about that with the Globe and Mail. Let's get to today's AMI Audio Digest. If you're the type to regularly check the front page of news websites, you probably noticed that around the time of the federal elections, the news seems to be covered a little differently. Well, that's because these newspapers like the Globe and Post Media, they practically do become completely different beasts overnight. And the Globe and Mail published an article recently about the guardrails for ensuring their election coverage is fair and impartial. And they're pretty extensive. This is a great article. Corinne Van Dusen is the host of the Globe and Mail today on AMI Audio. She's joining us from Toronto. And I don't know about you, Corinne, but I thought that piece was fascinating.
Yes, it's by Globe Standards editor Sandra E. Martin. She does pop up every now and then when there are events like this to say, this is what the Globe does. You can write emails into the Standards desk to ask questions, to talk about what the Globe will do for certain things. It's the piece is titled "More Than a Horse Race: What Goes into Election Coverage," and Sandra E. Martin writes, even before Prime Minister Mark Carney called an election on March 23rd, readers had begun emailing me with their rightful demands for balanced coverage of the parties, their leaders, and their campaign promises. There's not a lot of grace with readers right now, I think because they're worried about misinformation or bias, conflicts of interest as well. So that was a quote from Gavin Adamson, who talks throughout this article. He's the undergraduate program director and professor at Toronto Metropolitan University School of Journalism. So throughout the article, they talk about how they try to stay unbiased, how they try and give fair coverage to everyone with certain points. They say they look at what are the parties promising and how will they pay for it. So they look at the pitches and the platforms and, a costing plan for them and report on all of those things when they can. What do voters care about most? People who vote in Alberta are not going to care about the same things that people who vote in New Brunswick are, because they're
Right.
completely
Mhm.
different places in the country. So you have to cover east to west. You can't just focus on, central Canada or West Coast or East Coast. Challenging misinformation and disinformation. So this was
Mm.
an interesting point because a 2019 article in The Walrus claimed humans aren't great at making rational voting decisions. And they cited an example as former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson repeatedly claiming that by leaving the EU, Britain would regain control of £350 million that could be spent on the National Health Services. But UK Statistics Authority debunked this claim, but there was continued to be invoked, and voters ultimately supported Brexit because of something that was repeated, even though it had been debunked, and said, nope, this isn't what it is. Another interesting tidbit in this section is they define what misinformation is compared to disinformation. So misinformation is defined in the Globe Style Book as bad information shared without realizing it is misleading, while disinformation has an intent to deceive. And they say they're real threats to the electoral process. Another point that I thought was really interesting: careful use of photography. You have to make sure that you don't take pictures of one candidate always looking happy and the other candidate always looking upset, or one candidate in perfect lighting and another candidate, in coming out of of dark places and such. So
They're
that's
looking
something
like a
you have to keep in
schlub
mind.
lurking in the
Mhm.
shadows.
Yeah. So that's something they have there at their photography section, talk about. Say there's photo guidance to provide the best overall equal representation that they can.
It I genuinely believe that democracy is the best way, of course, not questioning that in the least. But I do really worry about what you mentioned about humans, including myself, not being very good at making unbiased, rational decisions. And I almost wonder what we can do to really educate ourselves in the most neutral way so that we're really voting according to our values and not sort of just the latest kind of uh, tone that's taken over the media. And I don't know what we do other than, like we were saying earlier in the show, just consume the most media possible, including from different authors, sources, than we uh, usually would. But then that gets us back to the misinformation puzzle. Yeah, it's a real puzzle, isn't it?
Well, this article really just really covered what the Globe is doing. So if you're reading the Globe,
Of course,
how
absolutely.
they are going to look at things. So again, as you said, you should look everywhere. But if you're reading the Globe, they do make a great point at the end that they said reading one story in isolation is never going to be a great way to assess our entire coverage. And I would say
Mm.
that goes for absolutely anything. You can't read one story in the Globe and say this is what they believe, or one story in the Toronto Star, the Washington Post, or anything like that. So it's constant self-examination and growth. So I thought this is definitely an interesting piece to listen to because it talks about what they try to do. And again, it's their standards editor who wrote it, the Globe Standards editor Sandra E. Martin. She's right in the thick of it, so she knows what she's talking about.
And Corinne, to that point, when you say that, like, you can't just say that a publication like the Globe and Mail is biased because of one article that's critical of one party leader or another, that kind of applies to if you're just like on the front page and you see a list of 20 or so articles. It might just be that Carney's having a bad day and he's kind of getting smacked at that point in time. Like, you need to look at it over days, which is a point that the standards editor makes in this article. This is such a good one, and we didn't even scratch the surface. Corinne, thank
Yeah.
you so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
That was Corinne Van Dusen. She's the host of the Globe and Mail Today on AMI Audio. That show airs at 10 a.m. Eastern and repeats every 6 hours on AMI Audio. She was joining us from Toronto.
Speaking of research, checking your facts, all that good stuff, our AMI research panel is still open where you can help us make all of the decisions we make regarding media and accessibility, and maybe even get compensated at the same time for long form studies. You can check out our website at ami.ca/panel if you'd like to join up, ami.ca/ panel is the place to be.
Grant, your plug for the AMI panel is so ubiquitous, but not as ubiquitous as Microsoft. And the reason that I bring it up, it's because they're celebrating a birthday. It's their 50th anniversary. Can you believe it? They were founded in 1975. But I want to talk about it with Stephen Scott. He's the host of Double Tap on AMI Audio. He's joining us from Glasgow, Scotland. How's it going, Stephen?
I'm good, guys. How are you both today?
We're surviving,
good.
and we're connecting through
good.
the magic of Microsoft and Windows, which has been around for decades now. And as a company, there's not that many companies that have that ubiquitous status. I can think of McDonald's, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Google, and then I start scratching my head. How do you reflect on Microsoft, Stephen?
Well, I mean, it's always been there in our lifetimes, right?
Mhm.
And, I think it's a company that's been there for so long. It's had such a huge impact on all our lives, perhaps not even knowingly, because, even growing up, it was, for me, something that seemed quite far away. We didn't use PCs when I was at school, back in the old days. We didn't use them at all. We had other devices which were, stayed for about a year or two and then died off because of Microsoft Windows. I was at school when Windows 95 became a thing. And that was really when we got a little bit excited about, where things were going. It wasn't the first time we saw it, with a keyboard and a mouse in that way. We obviously saw that with Windows 3.1. But, back in those days, we weren't really I certainly wasn't paying that much attention to it. Windows 95 came along, applications became a thing. The internet was starting to become a thing. It was very limited. I remember never having any interest in going online because there was nothing there. It was just an empty desert. There was nowhere to go. And, websites were sparse. I remember the BBC website here in the UK was one page. I remember those days pretty well. And, now it's many, many millions of pages. And I'm sure it's the same for CBC or any other major broadcaster these days. And it shows you how things have changed, but computing made that happen, and Microsoft were at the forefront of that. Now, of course, those of you who know me well enough will say, well, surely he's going to say Apple at some point. Yeah, of course, Apple were along for the ride as well, but a little bit later, when they started to get into this more seriously, and certainly caught on, I would say Apple for a long time was more niche in many ways, and it had a lot of problems getting established. Microsoft managed to establish itself as the business computer, as the device that if you were going into work, this was the device you would use. And that still carries on today. That legacy continues. And it's partly what drives the excitement and the annoyance of Windows, because it has such a legacy.
Yeah, it's hard to understate, whatever word that is. The legacy of Microsoft and Windows is so huge that it's really hard to talk about my life without talking about Microsoft. And I grew up in the 1990s, where every year there was more accessibility. One year, we got support for accessing the internet. And then, we started to get access to markup in Word documents and that sort of thing, and just on and on and on. And it's really hard to underestimate the role that Windows and my screen reader have played in my life and my education. And it's hard to believe Microsoft is 50, but when you look back on all the technology that I relied on growing up and still do, it's really just amazing. And I'm sure, Stephen, that's been the same impact really for you.
It has. I mean, look, Microsoft has been at the core of everything that I have been involved in. And certainly, when it came to employment, when it came to work, when it came to capability, I had to know how these systems worked, because they gave me the tools to be able to do the job. Now, when it comes to the accessibility part of it, of course, that story takes us on a whole other journey, doesn't it? Because we think about the joy of the fact that the reality that it gave us, the keys to essentially have a job. Can you imagine a world today where a company like Microsoft had never bothered with accessibility, and Apple had never bothered with accessibility, and Google and Samsung and Amazon, no one really bothered with it, and we were just at the beginning, but we're essentially where we were 50 years ago? Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that world? And of course, we're not there.
And it's such a good point, too, just to add quickly, that I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but blind people believed we would be left behind by Windows. And again, with the touchscreens, it was just sort of obvious.
I think
and
that's,
it didn't happen.
Yeah. That's common though across the board, isn't it? When it comes to these devices, I remember the iPhone conversation. I too felt like I was going to be left behind when the iPhone came along because and we were. Don't get me wrong, we were in those initial years because there was no accessibility built into those early iPhones. So we all thought, hang on a minute here, are we left behind here? Is this a whole new world? And look, these were not the only devices. Microsoft and others and companies have been making these products. Palm Pilots was the thing back in the day that I used to play with and get all excited about. These were, essentially little computers that you had a full-size keyboard on, very much like what became BlackBerry later on. And we all thought it was going to go that way. And again, there was no accessibility in any of those products. So it wasn't a huge leap to imagine that, we would be in a position where we'd be left behind. Thankfully, that was never the case with Windows. The only thing I will say, of course, is we can all happily forget the days of Windows Vista and Windows 8, which, now, just for you, Jacob, these are the days when you'd buy a computer system in a box. I don't mean the hardware, I mean the software. We'd go into a store and we'd buy a box.
Like a cardboard box? Like, what do you mean, a box?
Yeah.
Legit.
Like a cardboard box, like buying a videotape. You would walk.
It's
people
not
used to
on the
queue
computer?
up. No downloads, none of that. You would walk in, you would buy it off a shelf. If you wanted Microsoft Word, you had to buy it in a box. You would take it home, you'd install the software. The only upside to that was you got one update a year, and that was because you went out and bought the update in a box.
Oh my God.
Not like today where it gets updated every 30 seconds, which drives me mad. But different times for sure. But certainly it's a great anniversary, great chance to talk about what's been cool. And on the show today, we're talking about our first PCs. Thinking back to the days of our first computer, which for you, Jacob, is probably something about 5 years ago, I would imagine, just because, you're 30.
I'm not 12, Stephen. How old do you think I am?
I have no idea. You're young. That's all I know, and I don't like it.
Well, there's nothing I can do about that. Stephen, thank you so much. Have a good one.
Thanks, guys. Have a good day.
Was Stephen Scott. He's the host of Double Tap on AMI Audio. That show airs at noon Eastern and repeats every 6 hours. It's also available as a podcast, and that includes YouTube.
First airing at 11 a.m. is the Washington Post, 11 a.m. Eastern on AMI Audio, repeating every 6 hours and hosted by Mike Ross. And one of the articles he's going to be reading today is from the editorial board. IRS data privacy is a right worth fighting for. That's the title. And, this always brings me back to something that I've always wondered about. When I sign up for one government service, whatever, and I'm trying to get another government service, why do I have to re-enter my info all the time? Why can't they just pull it from the info they already have? And the reason is privacy, which is super valuable. So in the US, immigration officials right now are wanting to dig through taxpayer data at the IRS to help with their goal of finding 7 million people they say are in the US illegally. And they're wanting to find personal information, contact information. And the editorial board argues you need a court order for that. There is some precedent for that. Even in criminal cases, in order to access tax info in the government by a prosecutor working for the government, you need to have a court order. And what they're doing here isn't really a criminal matter. It's a little bit of a lower standard, I believe, but they're saying they should be subject to the same high standard. Ironically, Nixon resigned after setting up a special commission to kind of dig through all his political opponents' tax info and come up with ways to make their lives miserable. And then at that point, that's when some laws were passed to basically reduce the power to just go through people's tax information. So currently at the IRS, you cannot just go through people's tax information. Elon Musk at DOGE is dismissing any privacy considerations without the profanity. He says, bruh, if I wanted to go through people's personal information, I could have done that at the company that became PayPal, is essentially what he said. Of course, complicating all this is the fact that DOGE is slashing the IRS. More than a quarter of workers are being laid off, which is going to create a lot more chaos, especially if they have to do things that they're not supposed to do that are going to be subject to legal battle. So they're basically saying, Jacob, if you want to go through snoop on someone's tax information, you need to get a court order to do that. We should be upholding taxpayer privacy. Oh, and just one other point quickly is that the editorial board is arguing that that the people in the White House, in the government, they are closely guarding their names in matters like this because they're
Oh,
afraid
are
they'd be
they
subject
now?
to harassment.
Oh.
So
Oh,
their
okay,
privacy
so
matters.
yeah. Oh, okay, I see. Yeah. And you know, Trump famously fought in court to not have his tax records released, as has
Oh,
been
such a
customary
good
for every
point.
president since the Watergate scandal, which was also Nixon. Geez, every time I hear about Nixon, that guy seems less and less reputable. But so
Oh,
tax privacy matters for Trump. Clearly, he fought it for years and failed, by the way. But it doesn't for everyone else, apparently.
that's such a good point. And I don't know why they didn't think to mention that. You should be working for the Washington Post editorial board, but it's such an amazing point.
Well, the only
Yeah.
thing I can think of is that they're looking into the IRS information of people who are reportedly illegal migrants or living in America
Right.
illegally,
Mhm.
whereas Trump is the president. And so maybe there's just different standards there.
There is some there is some irony there for sure.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely some irony. Anyways, that's the Washington Post, 11 a.m. Eastern, and it's a really good article, really meaty article there. Oh man, tax privacy, releasing people's tax information, that's kind of a tough pill to swallow. You know what else is a tough pill to swallow? Avocados. Kelly and Company coming up at 2 p.m. Eastern. Sorry. Yes. At 2 p.m. Eastern. And we have the gentleman himself, Mr. MacDonald. Hey, Kelly, would you be happy with your tax information handed over for nefarious purposes? I'm guessing.
Never for nefarious, but then again, somebody nosing around as to how you get away with this and that. That's probably nefarious as it is, because you don't want someone killing your gig out there. That's for sure. Now, I do have to say, guys, and we'll get to the avocados, but I love it today. Question to Stephen Scott from Jacob: what, in a cardboard box? No wonder he made the 5-year remark. And you notice how quiet Grant sat there, right? No wonder he made a computer 5 years ago.
I'm feeling old today. You know what? I don't even know how much different we are in ages, but last week, Jacob, you said you hadn't heard of the dial-up modem or used it. This year, today, it's the software in boxes. Is it just me, Kelly? I feel old.
Oh my gosh. No wonder Steven came after you with that. I thought, oh, is Steven just going to let that go like he didn't hear it? No, Steven slid right in. Jacob. And I know, Jacob, you weren't trying to be offensive. I get it. It's kind of like when you mentioned videotapes and stuff. I wonder, is Jacob going to say, was that really a thing?
I don't know, man.
Yeah,
to me, if it was coming in an actual box, what was in the box? I'm genuinely like, Kelly, can you answer this, please? Like, what was in that box? A USB?
That's back in the days when computers had disk drives, and you popped them in, copied it over. Man, I'm glad you weren't around for my talk about the days I had the Oxford Dictionary, which were like 16 volumes, came out in 1957, came in a huge wooden case, like it was like two shelves of a big heavy bookshelf, and that was the Oxford Dictionary.
Oh my god.
Yeah, you legitimately had a box with a paper that had a key that you'd have to enter into the software, and a case with a disk that you'd open up and pop into your computer. And
do you notice Grant didn't explain any of this during the conversation before, Jacob? It's like Grant was sitting there almost saying, wow, what are you talking about, Steven?
Oh yeah, this is only theoretical, Kelly. I don't want you to think I have used this.
Yeah, this is from his booklet. Settle down, boys, and have some avocados. Today on the show, some people think that they're rich and delicious. To others, they're mushy and tasteless. Where do you guys fall, Jacob? Do you like them?
Okay. Can I if you don't like avocados, I feel like there's a 50% chance that you're being intellectually dishonest because so much food tastes mushy and bland if you don't put
Right.
stuff on it, right?
Right.
We're not eating avocados like they're apples. Like you spread them with lime juice or cilantro or put them as a topping in a taco or a sandwich or something or in a salad, right? You don't eat it just like that. If you don't like guacamole, for example, I think in that case, you just don't like avocados. But most of the time, like most foods taste bland on their own. And so when somebody says they don't like avocados, I am taking that with a grain of salt. I love avocados because they're a great ingredient. They're not a meal in it like on their own. They're great
Right.
ingredients. What about you?
But it's the taste of it. I'm sure some taste it one way, some taste it another. Grant, notice I hesitated to coming to ask you, but I'm gonna bet
Yeah,
a
let's.
texture, not really a texture fan.
Haven't had. If I've had them at all, I don't even remember.
Okay, all right.
Um,
So the question
and
is,
probably
are
would
they
never
rich in
try.
nutrients? Are they as empty in nutrition as they are in taste? This is what Julia Caranchis is going to explain to us today on the show. And also Michael Babcock, he's back with us. It feels like it's been ages since he's been on the show, like sometime during the middle of the winter, it feels like. So we'll see what he's been up to. And because he's been so busy of late, he's decided to talk about cleaning the digital clutter out of our lives, especially on this anniversary day. That's really probably a good thing to start, fellas.
See, it used to
Let's
be that
ask
digital
him.
clutter would actually be cardboard boxes piling up in
I
the
was gonna
corners,
Oh
say.
man.
God,
Like,
they were too. Oh, and they were. It was awful. Or sometimes you got these neat plastic cases that you needed a key for. I had one with my Jaws disc in it, and it had a key because somebody's just going to break in and steal Jaws.
like an actual metal
Right.
key? Wow.
Yes, like a suitcase key.
We'll talk about it
Briefcase.
another time, Kels. There's a lot to unwrap here. Kels, have a good one. This was awesome.
All right, guys, take it easy. Have a good day, everyone.
That was Kelly MacDonald, host of Kelly and Company on AMI Audio. That show is at 2 p.m. Eastern and repeats every 6 hours. It's also available as a podcast or on YouTube. That means you can download it. You don't need to order it in a box. That's all the time we have for today's AMI Audio Digest. Grant, thank you so much for tagging along.
Thanks,
If
Kyle.
you're listening on AMI Audio, playing an audiobook review is going to play in just a second. Today, Red Sill and I share our favorite works of satire, highlighting Joseph Heller's Catch-22 and a bunch of works from Terry Pratchett. Those two are hysterical. Remember, you can find audiobook review wherever you listen to podcasts, and that includes YouTube. I'm Jacob Shymanski. Let's talk audiobooks.